All right, Goose, talk to me.
All right, awesome. All right, so yeah, so like I said, big fan. Like I think my first introduction to you was Final Impact back in '92 with the great Lorenzo Lamas. That was the
Oh,
first.
Lorenzo, yes.
Yes. So I just want to talk to you, man, about martial arts, about your life, about getting into the film industry, and then about the movies that I've been watching. All these. I don't want to make us sound old. I'm hitting 50 this year, so yeah, not to make it sound old, but yeah, I've been with you since Final Impact. So yeah, so I've been watching
Oh,
you for a while.
nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you've been there. I needed you.
Yeah, yeah. So Michael, so again, this is my website is called ACTION-FLIX.com. You're on the ACTION-FLIX podcast. That's what I do in relation to my website. This is how I do my interviews now. And what I'm doing is I'm doing a series of interviews with old school action stars such as yourself. Like I've talked to Marshall Teague, who you know very well, and Daniel Bernhardt. I've done Don the Dragon Wilson, so
Right.
I've been seeing you on social media, and I'm like, I was like, I want to try to talk to Michael because, like I've been a big fan of yours. So I just want to start off, talk about your martial arts, your journey into the martial arts. Like, tell the fans, like, how, I'm sure you've talked about stuff like this before, but for me and my fans, like, how did you get into martial arts? What made you want to start, and do that?
I started like that typical comic from the 50s where Charles Atlas had, some kid got sand kicked in his face, and that, except in my case, I was getting beat up in school, and this was right after, Bruce Lee had kind of hit the scene and kids were taking broomsticks and cutting them in half and putting chains between them and going around and cracking people with these like makeshift nunchakus. And anyway, so I said, okay, that's it. I'm done. I've seen Bruce take these guys out. I got to do it. And that was kind of what got me going. I actually started in Aikido. That was the very first thing I learned was studying Aikido. And it wasn't quite clicking on me the way I at that age wanted to, at that point your testosterone's starting to go and you're like, you want to start grappling. And, I didn't want to sit there and be so peaceful and like push people aside. Right. So, I started studying Kung Fu at that Northern Shaolin, which again wasn't exactly competitive, but it was, I started getting really into the philosophy of it. And I really enjoyed it. A guy named Master Chang, he lived out here in the Bay Area. And then I started, I was literally going to 3 different martial arts schools at the same time. And then I went to one that was called Wu Pai, which was Kung Fu, but they were all trained for fighting in karate tournaments. So I began doing just like the Karate Kid, man. I was out there I started fighting in karate tournaments when I was 13, 14 years old. And my nickname was Vanilla Flash. They called me that because I was walking through Oakland one night and I kept hearing these guys calling me from the alley going, "Hey, Vanilla, get in here, Vanilla." And I was like, I went to my school the next day and I told the guy, Ronnie Wright, who I was one of my trainers, I was like, Ronnie, these guys kept calling me Vanilla, man. He goes, "That's it, you're Vanilla Flash from now on." So anyways, so that's kind of why I got started in martial arts. And it just stuck to me, between Bruce Lee and just the experience of training, it was just, it just hit.
Now, in terms of like the film business, like, was this something you always like? I read your bio, and it said you directed your a movie when you were 10 years old. Is that correct?
Loosely directed.
Yes.
Yeah, but directed. I even had a script. It was a page and a half long.
Yeah.
Yeah, I at 10 years old, I got my first. I don't know why. I do know why. I mean, Ray Harryhausen, who's an animator from the 40s and 50s,
Yep.
maybe the 50s and 60s actually, but really inspired me with like 7 Voyages of Sinbad and, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, when I could see what somebody could do with a little, what I knew, was an armature and a latex and the different materials, and created this like giant dinosaur attacking, New York. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And so it just got me into the magic of what film was. So I went out and started trying to do my own versions of Ray Harryhausen. And so the first film I did was called The Tire. And I just, it was a story about a rocket ship that's flying off to the moon, and a tire falls out as it's going up to the moon, and it hits the ground going 100 miles an hour and just runs over people. That's all it did. So I would, as a 10-year-old, I animated the rocket.
Yeah.
And I walked around. I had the tire fall out. It was all paper cut animation, like kind of like Monty Python. And then I just walked around and came up to total strangers, this little tiny kid going, I want to film you flying over my camera, because I'd seen in The Little Rascals this episode where they were in go-karts and they'd hit people. And then I remember just people would fly over the camera. And I thought, oh, that's a great way to do it. So that's how I started doing it. Anyways, the tires started my filmmaking career. I never stopped. I mean, I made Dracula versus the Sea Monster. I made American Pigolo, where I used 2 pig fetuses from school on strings to be, like American Gigolo, which I had no idea what a gigolo was. But
right.
Anyway, I went on and on and on until by the time I was in my late teens, I was doing, 35, 40-minute kung fu movies and, drafting all my friends. And so I was fusing the two at that point, my martial arts and filmmaking.
Now let's talk about your foray into the entertainment business. Now how did you get your foot into the industry? Like what was your first experience?
I knew nobody. I actually, when I first went to LA, it was a year before I moved there. I went there right after I graduated high school, and I just went down. I knew somebody that was going to school at UCLA, and I slept on his dorm floor. Oh, his roommate hated me. It was like, they're crude enough for 2 people, and they had this other kid lying on the ground. And then I just got a subscription to what a thing called, I think it was called the Drama Log back then. It might've been called something else, but it was just a paper that you would get once a week and would have auditions in the back. And I would just send my picture, which I think I had my mom take or something. It was like a terrible headshot, and then a faked resume with some plays that I'd done up here in Northern California, and then just send it off and try and get an audition. I had one phone call, I remember, with a guy who just called me to talk to me about something, but never turned into anything. Anyways, then I came back. I was here for about 6 months in the Bay Area, and then I just packed my car up with my dog and moved down to Venice Beach and didn't know a single soul, and just started trying to figure it out. And how I got my foot in the door was, luckily, while I was on Venice Beach working out, a guy came along who was a talent manager, and not a very big talent manager, very small one actually, which is perfect. He came up and he saw me. He says, "Hey, you an actor?" And I was like, "Yeah, I want to be," And he's like, "Well, hey, let's," and he gave me his card, and and he ended up being the first one to start sending me out on stuff. It was mostly extra work. Right. I'd go and make $40 a day just being in the background of some film. I still occasionally see myself wandering through a background shot or something, and doing stunts. I started doing stunt work too. So that was how I started anyway.
Now, obviously, like my first introduction to you was, like I said, was Final Impact. Like talk about starting the work for PM Entertainment, because I felt like Canon Films was big in the '80s. I think that they kind of took up the mantle in the '90s, delivering that type of action to the masses. That was so popular. So talk about starting to work for them.
Yeah, I'd actually gone into Canon Films because I had written a script, and I met a guy, and I actually wrote a script that it's kind of funny. It was about these guys that go to Vietnam, and it was playing off the whole Vietnam thing, and it was about the 18-year-olds Vietnam. Anyway, so I went into Canon Films with this, and it never went anywhere, but it ended up, I think, becoming they took the exact idea and turned it into because it was dealt with the Amerasians, and turned it into Missing in Action 3, I think it was what it was. But anyways, so when I got the audition for Final Impact, which Don the Dragon Wilson actually was coming in and audition for, by the way, too, I remember. It was at that time, it was around that time, and I had just done a bunch of little guest spots on films, and that was the first lead I booked. And I went in and I auditioned for it once, and excuse me, Kathleen Kinmont was in there, and Lorenzo and Eric Lee and Joe Murray, and went in and threw a bunch of kicks and read some dialogue with Lorenzo, and I left. And it was funny because I think the next day, normally when you do an audition, how many you have to do to get the part.
Right.
normally some producer at some point, or I take that back. Your agent usually is the one that calls you. The producer usually calls the agent and calls you. In this case, somehow they decide they want me, and they mentioned it to Eric Lee, and Eric Lee had no idea. They hadn't told me, and Eric Lee called me up and he's like, "Hey, it's Michael. Hey, good, Michael. I'm glad we're going to be working together. I wanted to talk to you about doing her." I go, "What are we working? What are we working on?" And he's going, "Can you hold on a minute?" And "Oh, I got to call you back." And so he dropped the ball early, but I was really excited.
So let's talk, like I said, because this is my first movie I saw you in. So again, I love the fact, like, because like towards the beginning of the movie, because another favorite of mine is Gary Daniels. You get a couple fight scenes with him. So talk about working with Gary Daniels.
So Gary, I think was the second day of shooting, I remember, and I knew he was through them. I'd never seen him before.
Right.
It was great. We shot both those scenes that Gary and I did on the same day. That whole scene in that nightclub was all shot one day. And it was good. You know, one of the things about working with Gary, working with Lorenzo, working actually at PM Entertainment is very early on, I got a crash course in independent filmmaking. I mean, you know, just in terms of how to do fight choreography, just in terms of how to shoot quick, how to, you know, steal shots. I mean, everything, you know, it was, but Gary's great. And Gary and I used to run into each other all the time. Him and a guy named Ron Ewan, who's in a number of my films at the time. He and I and Gary were all friends, and we'd all, you know, go to events or things together. But I love Gary; he's a cool guy. But it was great working with him, and I had a fun time doing that sequence with him.
Yeah, and it's one of my favorites. And of course, working with Lorenzo, like, who I was a fan of, you know, because he was doing like the same type of movies during the time. So talk about working with him.
Yeah, I mean, Lorenzo is, you know, I was fully aware who Lorenzo was at the time. So when I walked in, he was in the, I remember being like, "Oh my God, it's Lorenzo Llas."
Yeah.
Lorenzo Llas' son, you know, and I got to know him really well through that shoot. He, what was funny is that when the way it worked was, it's not like they flew us all to Vegas to shoot the movie. We all packed up in our own cars and drove to Vegas. So I drove down with Lorenzo and Kathleen.
Okay.
And on the way to Vegas, so this is part of the independent, you know, education, we stopped in Barstow. And in Barstow, there was this exterior of this place in the middle of nowhere, which is where we made it look like we were going into, I think when I went and fought Fairboars, who's the guy that I fought at one point in the middle, early on in my training, I go in and fight him. And then we drove to another location where we were going to shoot a scene on a Ferris wheel that was just right before Las Vegas. That ended up getting cut out of the movie, but it was a little scene. So we're literally driving and shooting as we went along. And as soon as we arrived in Vegas, I mean, I didn't get to my hotel room. Joe's like, "Okay, we're going to this motel. Everybody meet there. We're going to start shooting." I'm like, "Well, okay, all right, fine." I didn't know any different. So the scene where I come out of my hotel and then Lorenzo's sitting on a car and he's like, that was the very first thing we shot when we got to Vegas.
Okay.
And right in that same motel that night, I think we shot the scene where I get kind of beat up in front of a Pepsi machine or something like that.
Yeah.
Which that scene there was sort of, Joseph Murray turned to Lorenzo and said, "Lorenzo, you direct this scene." So Lorenzo actually directed that scene, but it was, I remember when we shot it. But anyway, yeah, so it was like that through the, you know, there was like, they had permits and certain things, but a lot of it was just grabbing stuff and running around, and it was great. It was very energetic. I'd never been to Vegas before. That was my first time in Vegas. So I got to sort of, as an actor, play this element of realism because and the character had never been there either. It was his first time. So it was kind of cool for that.
Now, what I loved about the movie is you and Lorenzo. You had great chemistry together. Like it looked so easy. Like, you know, like him taking you under his wing. You know, and those were my favorite scenes of the movie. Like him teaching you and stuff like that. And I just loved how, like, you know, because you had that kind of cocky thing going for him. You know, and how he kind of put you in your place, like, you know, a couple of times and stuff like that. So just talk about like doing those scenes. You know, and like, would Lorenzo like talk to you, like, you know, behind it, you know, like give you any like little like tips or anything, like or would you pick his brain at all?
Yeah, I mean, I was, you know, as a pretty new actor at the time. I mean, you know, I was pretty young but very open. And I think in a sense that part of it was perfect for what I was playing. And I was a sponge. I wasn't like unable to take criticism, whether it was from Joseph Murray or from Lorenzo. Well, not that they're criticizing you, but I'm just saying I was open to like, try it this way now or do it this way. And Lorenzo, he was good that way. I mean, he was a very giving actor. If I said, you know, he's not like one of these guys who, you know, if they need to shoot over his shoulder and they need to shoot on me, he'll get right up and jump in and just to use his shoulder. He's not like, yeah, go get my stand in. You know, he wasn't that kind of guy.
Right.
He was he had a knee injury, I remember at the time, but we would still sometimes spar and train together off camera just to kind of keep the workflow going together, because it was something we liked doing. And that we toured around. I remember we'd go run around, him and Kathleen and I would run around Vegas together, and there's some photos online somewhere. We went to the church where he got married. When he didn't marry her, but he married, oh no, he did marry her. Yeah, it was their wedding where they got married. He'd been married before, but I couldn't remember if the wedding was where he was. Anyways, I think he and I really tried to engage in that sort of back and forth off camera as much as possible, just to keep it so it was fun for us to be on camera together, you know.
Right, absolutely. Now, this was your first like big movie, like doing martial arts sequences. Now talk about like, you know, going through that for the first time. You know, did it come easy for you? I mean, obviously, because you're, you know, like it looked like it did because we were watching the movie. Like you looked phenomenal. But just, you know, any good anecdotes or anything like, you know, like doing the fight, because you fought a lot of guys in it.
Yeah, and I can tell you, well, the fighting part was fairly easy. I understood that you're not really fighting, so I got that aspect of it. It wasn't like I had to retrain my brain to.
Right.
Yeah, but that being said, you know, you still are learning about how you, and I can tell you, it's interesting now where I am, where I can see how different we would shoot fight scenes back then. For instance, every fight you see, this is pretty much true 100%, was filmed beginning to end in one take. So on a couple of master shots, because what they would do is they would do a master shot of everything, which means they would get one or two cameras and set it somewhere with which angles they liked. And then we would just from the very beginning to the very end do the fight scene. And then they would come in usually with a handheld camera and go, okay, let's see the first three moves, 1, 2, 3. And then they pick it up from whatever little angle they wanted to make sure they get all the hits. But the thing is, it's really exhausting to do fight scenes, particularly long ones, in one take. And they're getting kind of sloppy, or you're getting close with the clipping each other. So, I mean, it's like you watch, you know, movies today, I'm sounding like an old man. Movies today, but you know, the way today most of the fight films are shot, they're not doing that. You know, they just go out there and they feel, okay, here's the first couple of moves, and they look good this way, and we're going to shoot it this way. You know, actually, that played into my life later when I was doing a fight scene with David Carradine on Aal Heat. Yeah. But where it would that fighting one take thing did not work out for us. Yeah. But that's how we did it, and it was, you know, Eric Lee was the choreographer at the time, but he relied a lot on Art Camacho, who was there at the time, and they were kind of grooming Art at that time to sort of take over and be the choreographer. So he was fairly involved in just pulling things together, and you know, we Lorenzo and I would just goof around and come up with ideas, and you know, if we were doing something and try and shoot it. And now, same with Jeff Langton, who played Jake.
Well, I was going to ask about, yeah, because like he was such a, dare I say, asshole in the movie, but I'm sure like in real life, you know, he was a good guy.
Oh, he's great. I just saw him a couple months back. He invited me to Frank Stallone's birthday party they were having in LA somewhere, and Frank was singing jazz, and I went there, and he was there, and yeah, no, Jeff's great. He's a cool guy.
Yeah, because like when I saw him, he was in the movie. I'm like, that's the guy that Jean-Claude Van Damme punched in the groin in Lionheart. You know, it's
right?
Like, yeah, it's like, you know, so that brought it full circle for me. Awesome. Now let's go. Now, of course, my next one is Street Crimes, which was also from '92. You got to work with the great Dennis Farina.
I love him. Yeah, Dennis was so great. Dennis was. Yeah, we struck up a good friendship on that movie. What was funny about that is because they knew when they got him that he was, you know, he was a notable name at that time, and he was kind of the biggest name they'd ever had at that point. And so they were happy with Final Impact. In fact, when Final Impact went to Cannes, when they screened it at Cannes, they called me really late at night. Joseph was so happy because he said, people were coming out with tears coming out of their eyes at the end of the screening, you know, all the buyers and stuff. So he was like, Michael, I just want to tell you, I'm so happy. I'm so happy. I was like, oh, great. I was like, oh, I'm cloud nine. And it was playing in theaters here in LA. I mean, back then PM was still getting their movies in theaters at that time. But then by the time they got to Street Crimes, the writer of Final Impact was given the opportunity to write and direct Street Crimes. So he was, and you know, he and I struck up a good relationship on Final Impact. So, you know, between him and Joseph, they decided to put me in the other part. And they told Farina, because they didn't want him to think, oh, I don't, because we're shooting Street Crimes in 11 days. So they said to him,
the whole
so
movie?
we want you for 10 days. Yeah, the movie. We shot the whole movie in 11 days. But what they told him was, they said, Dennis, you know, we're going to shoot this in 10 days, your stuff in 10 days, and then we got another couple of weeks of shooting. Well, somewhere, you know, so they would say that to me, don't let them know that we're doing this in 11 days. We don't want them to think we're, you know, I was like, okay, my mouth is shut. And then I don't know what day it was. It was like 5 or 6 days into it. I remember one time I was sitting down with him on a break and we're eating, and he goes, it's just amazing what you can do in 11 days with an entire movie. It's just crazy these days. And I was like, oh, he caught on. He knew. But he was a blast. He was a blast to work with. No ego again. You know, I've been really lucky to, for the most part, work with people that aren't jerks. And he was certainly one of them. That was great. And, you know, we shot that one all through LA pretty much, and Malibu a little bit, and Calabasas, which is all out here in California, or Southern California. Yeah, that was fun. That was some good fights. And that's where the movie that I brought Jerry Poteet and Fran Joseph on. Jerry Poteet was a student of Bruce Lee's, who I studied under, and I got my teaching under. And so I brought him in because I wanted to start slipping in a little bit of the JKD stuff that we had practiced, just so I could take it away from just the strict kickboxing kind of thing I was doing in Final. I was already thinking in my head, okay, I don't want to do the exact same thing. I don't want to fight the exact same way. You know, I don't want to have too much of a repeat of myself, you know, so I was really trying to stylize this guy differently from the other guy at the time.
Now what I liked about like especially with the PM movies, you know, it's like, you know, and again, these days in a lot of independent action, I think that's where you get the best fight scenes. Like, because obviously, you know, like with some of the blockbusters and stuff like that, a lot of stunt work is used, and that's where you get the edits and stuff like that. But everything, the angles, you saw everything perfectly. And what I loved about PM, like you would see all this, you know, like the long drawn out fighting part of it, but then there'd always be the money shot, you know, like where, you know, you're doing it and all of a sudden there's Michael in slow motion, like, you know, leaping up in the air and doing one of these. That's what I loved about the movies. And like, you know, and it just, and then seeing you go up in the air, it's like, that's what made me want to do, like, you know, I was a fan of Chuck Norris and stuff like that, but watching you do like these kicks and stuff like that's what got me into the martial arts, you know, watching. You know,
it's funny because I actually learned what you're saying is kind of interesting, because I kind of learned that as I was going through doing more martial arts films, that I began to, you go through evolutions of sorts, like of how do I want, you know, first I want this to be totally realistic. And then you're like, no, I want this to look just really outlandish, or, you know, you're messing around artistically and creatively to try to figure out what it is that works, you know? And, you know, and I would sit down and go, what did I love about Bruce Lee or Van Damme or Chuck Norris or, you know, Jimmy Wang Yu or whoever I was, you know, into at the time. And I began to realize, like what you were saying, that it's not always about, it's not just about being flashy or being even realistic. There is this element of being emotional almost in a way. And so like trying to find, how do we elevate this fight? How do we tell a story with the fight itself? Like, so it's not just here's 3 guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're all down on the ground. So what, you know, because you as a person watching it, you know, you watch, it's like when you watch Top Gun, right? And there's a moment where they have something that happens in the mission that you're wanting to happen, and you get a thrill and you're like, oh, that was a cool scene. And that's kind of what you want to do with fight scenes. You know, it's sort of like, you're not going to do it every time,
right?
But it's good as long as you can get it a couple of times in a movie. That's great. And so I had to sort of learn, and as you know, as I was going, like when I watch them back now, I can see there's a certain rhythm to those fight scenes. There's a certain cadence. There's a certain strategy. There's a certain, like you said, the jump kits, like I'll do a jump spin kick and they'll do it 3 times, like, that they saw Van Damme or however they edit it. You know what I mean? I would never know because I would just go out there and do it. And then the next thing I know, I'm doing it 5 times in a row.
Right.
But I, yeah. So, I mean, to what you were saying, it's like, yeah, it's like finding, it's like always trying to find not just the coolest thing, but what would maybe make me sit in an audience and come out inspired. That's kind of what it was. So I began to start thinking that way as I would go through and make these movies.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so now I want to get into, again, it's like I call my Michael Worth top 3 and
top 3 what? Mistake.
I'm a fan, but like one of them is To Be the Best, and this is probably one of the ones besides US Seals 2, and I'll get into that later on because that's like my Bible when it comes to you. But To Be the Best, you got the great Martin Cove, and again, such a Stephen Vincent Lee, and like,
yes.
And that's what PM did. Like and that's the thing that kind of annoys me now. It's like they get actors and try to teach them the aspects of fighting instead of back then. It was like they took like yourself who can fight but also can act, so that way you don't need the stunt double. You can just see you do it and then not have you know what I'm saying. So that's what I miss, and before we get into To Be the Best, talk a little bit about that, and what are your feelings on that?
No, I think you're right. I mean, they would bring actors in, I'm trying to think of a Wolf Larson or Lorenzo, who actually had skills. Lorenzo actually did study, but there were a number of actors they would bring in and kind of fake their way through it. You know what I mean? But you're right. We were in a period at that point where the martial arts skill, much like, and I'm not comparing this to that per se, but there's an element of this, much like when Bruce Lee first came in, where you were going through this sort of Basher era of filmmaking in Hong Kong, where they would do the same thing. They would have these guys like Jimmy Wang Yu, who is not the greatest fighter in the world, or T. Lung or David Chang. That were all actors, but it was okay with them going around with knives and kicking people and punching. But when Bruce Lee came on and everybody watched Bruce Lee, it was like, whoa, did you see how fast he just moved? Or did you see how beautiful that kick looked or whatever? And so suddenly people went, we got to get real fighters to start doing this. Is the coolest, and we, in that period of the early 90s, you were going through this no faking it kind of thing. When Seagal came out, it was the same thing. Everybody was like, oh, Seagal's an Aikido master, or Van Damme was, at least we thought, or whether he was or not, was a kickboxing champion. You know what I mean? So we as martial arts, not that, I could go into an audition. I didn't have to pull out a UFC belt and say, there was no UFC, but I'm just saying, pull out a belt that says I fought professionally. I've fought in 3 amateur boxing matches and literally 5 dozen Taekwondo and karate tournaments, but that's professional fighting. But I would go, but I knew I knew what I was doing. I would go out and fight and spar full contact with guys all the time. So my being there, and there are guys like Don the Dragon Wilson. Obviously, Don the Dragon was like, the real deal, right? I mean, you get guys like Gary Daniels, all these guys you knew. So they knew, the producers at that time knew that they couldn't put, it was tough. They knew that the people that were going to do best for them were the ones that they knew when they put on screen, the other martial artists that tend to go to these movies are going to go, real deal, real deal, real deal, And so that was an interesting time. So there was an elevation of sort. Like, I always had to feel I had to be. Luckily, I loved training. I did it every single day. I wasn't like, oh, I got a movie coming up, I better start doing my sit-ups again. It was like every day I was training. I was working with Dean LaBelle. I was working with Jerry Poteet. I was working with Dan DeSanto. I mean, the day I got here, part of the reason I came to Los Angeles wasn't just to make movies. It was to study with all these great guys like Bill Superfoot Wallace that I had, fell in love with as a kid. So. Yep. I loved martial arts. So when I had the opportunity now to be in martial arts movies, I'm telling you, I was a kid in heaven. I wanted to be a good actor. It was something that was important to me. So I was studying acting with a lot of people at the time. I really wanted to feel that was, I didn't want to just be the guy who's the karate guy or the kung fu guy. I wanted to be able to, later in my career, I even actually started really turning away almost anything where I was throwing a kick or a punch because I wanted to make sure people got it,
Right. Now, okay, before I go into some others, I want to talk about To Be the Best. So obviously you start with Martin Cove in that one, and we all know who Martin Cove is. If you don't know, then you shouldn't be listening to this podcast. I want to talk about the first time meeting Martin Cove. Take us through that.
First time I met Marty was in Vegas, and I totally knew who he was. I mean, I loved The Karate Kid. I saw that when I was a kid 3 or 4 times in the theater. So I was like, oh, he's going to be a jerk. He's going to be a jerk, And he shows up. Now, Marty's been one of my oldest friends now. I've used him a number of times in other films, but he was great. I loved hanging out with him and just talking stories. And I was very familiar with his other films outside of The Karate Kid. I knew him from back when watching him in films like with Jan Michael Vincent and different movies where he had little small parts. I was like, Marty Cove.
Yeah.
So, but he was great, and he's a real cowboy too, Marty. He loves going out and riding horses and getting out in the sun. So working with him on that was a total joy. I think, I'm not mistaken. I think, that's right. That was the first time I met him, was in Vegas. So we were already out there. The cast was already out there for a couple of days before he showed up.
Right. Now, like I said, this is one of my favorites, just because I love the aspect of how it's the world championships, but it's and I love the fact about the throwing the fights and stuff like that, and Vince Murdaco, who's another favorite of mine, who friended me on Facebook, which was totally awesome.
Well, Vinny and I will have a good little story. If we get to it later, I'll tell you about that comes up later in my career. But go ahead. This is what you're saying.
Okay, no worries. No, awesome. So basically, what I want to say is now the evolution of so this again, obviously another fight heavy movie, but now. Yes, I mean, like I said, that's why it's probably one of my favorites, And then plus, I love the scene with you hanging off the helicopter. I know, in terms of I don't know if it was green screen or what, but that's one of my favorites.
Part of it was, but part of it was actually real. They did have a helicopter out there doing it.
So they really had you hanging off of a helicopter?
For a little bit of it. I go up and off the thing, but they didn't want me swinging really big around. So they brought in, I forget the guy's name. He was great. You'll actually see, I've got some behind the scenes of To Be the Best. I put some of it up, I think, on one of my social media sites, but I've got 25 minutes of shot on VHS that's never been published anywhere. And it's really cool just of us making it. And that's part of that helicopter scene is in there. So you can see me getting in the harness, and then he gets on the harness. And but yeah, and then the part that was green screen, where crashes into the balcony and I fall on the balcony, that was shot about a month after the movie wrapped back in LA.
I always call that I don't, I always when I would talk to people about that was just your Die Hard scene, because it was kind of like in Die Hard when he went through the trying to cut it, it was kind of like the same thing.
I think that's exactly right. Well, and the funny thing is too, when I didn't want to miss this part of To Be the Best, but when I first showed up, the first thing they were shooting was when Philip Troy, who played my brother, was doing a fight. He was fighting these guys. It was like when you introduced him and then he gets on the motorcycle and rides off. But what happened was I showed up and my hair was, as you can see in the movie, was kind of long, and I saw Joseph, and Joseph was like, your hair's long. I was like, well, I was thinking, he's like, well, he goes, Mike, you got to do one to cut your, he was almost like saying, you better cut your hair, or I'm not going to put you in the movie, kind of thing. And I was like, going, well, what do you want the hair short for? I was like, fine. I go, and he goes, well, what we want to do is we want to use unused footage from Final Impact and put it in here of some fight scenes we didn't use with you and put it in this movie. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll go cut it then. And then somehow something took place over the next 24 hours, and he called me and goes, leave your hair, it's okay. We decided not to use that stuff, so I ended up not doing it. But I was like, geez, I'm about to lose a whole job for not cutting my hair. I love Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, again, talk about working with Stephen Vincent Lee, another one from that era that I enjoyed watching. Not Hung Do, you know, I love like.
Oh yeah. Well, first off, what's so funny about that is you watch it now, it's like the Thai team, and not a single one of those guys were Thai.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
they're all Chinese. Is it Chinese? I think they were all Chinese, actually, right?
Yeah.
Stephen. Yeah, yeah. Butchie is Hawaiian, so there was one Hawaiian.
Yeah, that was the thing. Like, yeah, I remember him. I'm like, I don't think he's
couldn't get away with that today. He could not get away with that today. But one of the things that was interesting about that was because there was so many of us doing, and there were so many fight scenes on the docket, and this was I think this was kind of Art's first real like challenge. Like he did Street Crimes, but this was kind of where he was really kind of getting up the task. They put up a tent in the parking lot of the hotel we were all in, and we would get up early in the morning and we would just all go into the tent because it was so bloody hot. And then basically Art would just send us off into our own corners and go choreograph your fight scenes. And then he would come around, and so I'd get together with whoever I was, and I'd just say, okay, let's try this. And then he would come over and watch a little bit, and he goes, well, try this instead, or do this instead, because Art didn't sit around and choreograph all those freaking fight scenes. It was like he said, you guys figure out what works best for you, then I'll come look at it and make some adjustments. So that was kind of fun. So Stephen and I would get together, and Stephen always had his little Tupperware with his chicken and his broccoli and his rice. We would all sit, and such Vinny Murdoka would give him such hard time. Like, Stephen, what are you eating, man? Wait, don't tell me. You're eating chicken, rice, and broccoli. Is that right? I got some pizza in my room. He would give him a hard time. It was funny. But yeah, that's how we would do the fights. And that went on for days. We would just be choreographing. I think my neck was more sore in that movie from taking punches than anything I'd ever done.
Now, like this, of course, that came out in 93. Now, that's when like the direct-to-video boom was really starting to crank up.
Yeah.
So talk about that, because obviously you were on the whirlwind of that. Because
they were. I think PM at that point was doing almost a movie a month.
Yes.
They were doing like 12 a year. They were just every month there was a new movie. It was crazy.
Yeah. So, but like and then being in the video stores, God, I miss them so much. There was nothing like going to a video store, and I'd be look on new release day, and every time I found like your picture on the cover, it was like a national holiday or something.
Oh, that's.
I'm serious though, but I'm like, yeah. So talk about the boom, because obviously there's all these actors trying to vie to be the next martial arts action star, but I believe you rose to that next level, because of the skill that you had, the acting skill that you had. So talk about a little about that, being on the cusp of such a big, because there was nothing like it. And I don't think we'll see anything like that again.
Well, yeah, that was an interesting time for sure. It was funny because Gary actually said that to me one time. We were, I don't know where we were at, something. I remember being at Universal Studios for some reason. I remember Gary came up to me and goes, Mike, the good thing about you is you're like the one of us that can act. He goes, I'm still working on that part of it. I started laughing, but I think that period, you're right. It was like you said, it was that people were figuring out there was a venue for making these movies and making money, and PM just had a routine, man. They just had it down. I remember that time, it was Don. I think he had a 6-movie deal with PM and a 6-movie deal with Corman over there at Concord.
Right.
And he would literally do a movie at Concord in March, and April he'd come to PM, and then May go back to. He was going back and forth. He and I almost did a couple of movies together, but they never came to fruition. But we never know. We still might. I've had an idea for him for a long time, and so he's a little more settled down in different ways now. So I think I could maybe make it work. But yeah, it was a very interesting time. I remember that whole, like you said, that straight to video thing that was going on. And I don't know, what was your exact question? I wanted to make sure I got it right. You were asking.
Just talk about, because you had like kind of an inside track, because you lived that boom. Like us as fans, like we lived it in the sense that yeah, we were enjoying the finished product, but you know, did you know that hey, you know, this is something special, you know, like this, you know, holy cow, you know, what's exactly going on? Because I remember, like, because my cousin opened up a video store, and that's why I knew of all these movies, you know, because and I remember working for him, and he'd get these books, you know, that said what movies are coming out. I try to be like, hey, you know, I would try to get him to, you know, get these, but just talk about, you know, talk to us about like being on the inside of what was happening at that time.
Yeah, I mean, they basically just had, you know, there was the AFM, which is still around today, American Film Market. There was Cannes. There was a couple of film markets that would happen every year, and basically these studios, PM, Canon, you know, Roger Corman, all the different, you know, even 21st Century, which is where I did Fists of Iron with Richard Munchkin and Aaron Schiffman. You know, these guys would just go to the markets with their films, and they would just walk in, and people were so hungry for the products back then. That's why Don could go off, and Cynthia eventually too. You know, they would just literally do a movie or every 2 months, you know, and they didn't care. It was like a TV series. You know what I mean? It's just give us another episode, give us another episode. And I remember that in-house process especially when I first went to Final Impact, when they were still doing theatrical releases, but everything was so in-house. It was like they had their editing system in there. They had, you know, their little studio that they would sometimes shoot in there, where they do the casting, the offices, but it was just all boom, 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 boom. And I remember ultimately, it was after I'd stopped working for PM, that sometime after I'd done Acapulco Heat, maybe you know the dates better, but I think when they went out, PM decided to experiment and spend like, you know, 8 to 10 times what they normally did, and did that Van Damme film with what's his name, who directed The Karate Kid, who I think took his name off the movie afterwards. But it was like so much money that they thought they could maybe elevate it, and I guess it didn't pay off. And you know, I don't think they ever went back to doing it ever again. You know, but they had a system up to that point that really worked. And but of course everything changes, you know, eventually. You know, even something like New Image, which, you know, did US Seals 2, they're now Millennium, you know, and they're doing these gigantic movies, The Expendables, you know, I just did Wanted Man for them, Rambo, whatever, you know, so. But yeah, that time was a great time, and I remember the markets and going to the markets, and you knew walking in, like, and the other, you just knew walking in. I was going to say, finish my sentence. You knew walking in that if you had a product, it was getting sold, you know. And then you had like you said, on the other side, that I didn't really realize till later. There was this cult of the video store, you know. It's like I started watching movies when I was young enough that I was kind of still catching the tail end of that grindhouse experience, where it was theatrical, you know. I mean, there was home video, but nobody was really owned a home video machine, and there wasn't any blockbusters. It was like strange little places you'd rent movies if you ever wanted to watch them. But so I have a certain like memory of that excitement of seeing the newspaper comes out Wednesday, you know, the clones of Bruce Lee with The Incredible Shrinking Man, and, you know, whatever the third bill was. And you'd go to the movie and pay your couple of bucks and sit down and watch it. But the video store has that same thing from, you know, a decade or two later, where, you know, it was like, you'd see the list, what was coming out on, you know, I remember this is a little off. No, it's not too off topic, but I always remember that Batman, the one with Michael Keaton, was such a specific hit that it hit theaters, and it stayed in theaters so long that while it was still in theaters, it came out on video.
Yeah,
I mean, like 9 months, 10 months later, or whatever it was. But anyways, that was the idea of that tactile tangibility of owning a tape. This is my favorite movie. You know, I remember buying my first VHS. It was Enter the Dragon. I bought the clamshell Enter the Dragon tape, and to have that thing, I knew I could wake up in the morning and go into the room and put it in the video machine and watch it. That was incredible. Yeah. So anyways, yeah, it was a great time.
Now let's talk about, you mentioned it already, Acapulco Heat, which I mentioned to you in my email. I still watch to this day. I have the box set. Now take us going to movies to going to television. Like, take us into the foray of Acapulco Heat.
Well, I had done television before. I just had never had a series regular show.
Right.
So this would be Yeah, this would be my first time being on a show as a series regular. But to this is what I wanted to tie in with Vince Murdocco. So I got a call from Vince, and I've known Vince since, let's see, that was a couple of years. So I guess we've been known each other for a couple of years at this point. He called me up and he says, and it's the only time he's ever done this, which you'll explain why he's never done it again. He said, Mike, I'm reading for an audition. It's a big thing for me. Would you come over and read with me? Because sometimes actors, we do that. We get together and we help each other to prepare for a part. So I get over with him, and he's going to go read for this show. And it's a show that is just going to hire Canadian. They have to suit these EU needs, like they're only hiring people from foreign countries, or like UK, Canada, blah blah blah. So he's from Canada.
Yeah.
Well, sure. So I went over there and we read, and I helped him. And then we took off, and he didn't end up getting the part. But the part he went in to read for was Tommy in Acapulco Heat.
No kidding.
And so then a month later, I get a call, and I go, hey, my manager calls me and goes, hey, we're going to go in for an audition for this thing. I'm reading it going, oh, wait, crap. This is the thing that Vinny was reading for. And actually, Keith Cook, I don't know if you remember Keith Hirabashi, Keith Cook.
Yes.
He was originally meant for that part. It was originally, they even have somewhere, it's out, I think I might even have it on video, but the original promo reel was him as my character. So it was written for him. And then I went in and read for it, and they called me back. I probably went in like 3 or 4 times, and eventually I booked the show, and it was great. I can tell you when you as an actor who, I was at that point, felt like I was doing pretty well. I didn't have a regular job other than movies, so right. That's always like a step. But to get a show where for the next 6 months you're employed, I can't tell you how great that is. So we all got together. I got to meet John Vernon and Fabio, and we went out and did, we did photo shoots, and that was like great. And just packed up our stuff and head out to Puerto Vallarta.
Now talk about working on it. Now, obviously, you had done, like you said, bit parts or walk-ons or stuff like that. But now this is your first. Right. You have a big part now. Now talk about because I've talked to other people in the past, and they say that television obviously is a faster paced. Because obviously you're filming like so many episodes and stuff like that, so stuff's like quicker. So talk about going from movies to now doing the same thing for television.
Well, since I'd done the PM thing, I was pretty much ready for the speed.
The guerrilla type of stuff,
Yeah, and they would shoot these episodes in 5 to 6 days, generally 6 days. We get 1 day off, and then we're back at it again. Now, you mentioned a minute ago, it was a big part. Well, the truth is it wasn't that big of a part. It was a consistent part because there was 10 of us on that shoot. So it was like, there would be like 3 or 4 days sometimes where I would be doing nothing. So I just go work out or explore. Eden was a place with a waterfall, which was nearby our location, or where we all stayed, which is where they shot Predator. I'd go up there all the time and just kind of hang out because it was so cool up there, Right. But it was a great learning experience. I just actually uncovered about 20 minutes of behind the scenes footage shot on video of that season. It was kind of fun to watch because once I was on set as a movie fan, it was great because I had people on there like Alan Hume, who used to shoot all the old British horror films for Hammer Productions. Sidney Ayres, the director who did like Burn Witch Burn, and a number. We had who came like Bernie Kowalski was one of our producers. He directed the Attack of the Giant Leeches back in the 50s, and as a B movie kid, who loved the horror movies, it was like I was with all these guys that did these movies. And then we get actors like Clifton Collins, or Clifton Gonzalez, sometimes him as he'd come on, get these great actors that would come on sometimes from different eras, like TV shows. And it was just great. It was such a fun way to learn. And it was where I first started to direct. I would sometimes go off and sneak off with one of the second unit crews and go, let me do something. Let me shoot a little something. And they would sometimes hand me the camera and I'd hand hold it and shoot a shot. It wasn't until the second season where I really started doing that a lot. But it was just, it was a great, I lived, you'll find this is very interesting. I lived in Mexico. I'm stepping back a little bit. Back in 1989 or 90, I lived in Mexico for 6 months, right near Puerto Vallarta. And I just went out there because I was struggling a little bit and it was tough. And I went out with my girlfriend and we lived in this little palapa, and I would write scripts and sit on the beach. And I would go to you have to take a boat to get into the main part of town, but I would go into the town. There was this one theater, and I would go in there to see the Van Damme movies that were usually playing or whatever. And I remember I used to sit in that theater and go, God, one day I'm going to see myself up on that screen. I used to say, I mean, I literally would come sit to my girlfriend, oh, I watched Van Damme and Bloodsport. That's what I want to do, or whatever movie it was of his. And flash forward, I was shooting Acapulco Heat, and a bunch of us went down to a sushi restaurant, and we passed that little theater, and To Be the Best was playing in that theater.
Awesome.
And I was like, I sat in that theater and said, I'm going to be up on that screen, and holy crud, I'm up on that screen. And we all went in and we all watched it. And the guys in the theater were great. They gave me I got the posters. They gave me the Mexican posters for the movie. In fact, one of them I gave to Marty Cove years later when I saw him. I said, and he was like, oh, give me that poster. I love it. Because it was a big picture of him. But yeah, that was kind of a fun story about Mexico.
Awesome. Now, give me 1 second here because I gotta restart my recorder because it only gives me so much time.
Oh yeah.
So
we're talking you to death, man.
No, this is Michael. I can't tell you how much of an honor. This is like the best thing ever. You just like made my year.
You're too kind.
Like to hear, like that's the one thing. Like I told you, like I love to hear the behind the scenes stuff of like all these movies that I've grown and to love. Like I said, you were talking about posters. Like I had all your posters up on my wall. Like
that's really cool.
It was just filled with like martial arts posters and stuff like that. So yeah. All right, so I'm gonna start recording again. Okay, now the biggest thing about Acapulco Heat is like you mentioned it. There was like 10 of you. You went like beyond there for a while because I was always watching you because I wanted to see. I'm like, I want to see more Michael. I want to see more Michael. And it was cool was when they revamped the show and they kind of made you the lead of the series, which was freaking awesome because that's as a fan what I wanted to see.
Well, it's funny. I want to tell you something about the first season. Another thing I didn't mention, what was interesting about it was there was some restriction. I don't know what it was called or what it fell under, but they wouldn't let me kick people in the head.
Okay.
They said you can't because of the violence code. You can punch them in the head, you can kick them in the stomach, but we couldn't kick in the head. So I'm pretty sure if you watch the first season of Acapulco, I never kick anybody in the head.
I did notice that. Yes, I did.
Yeah. But it was like a restriction. They wouldn't let me do it. So I was like, all right, well, I won't stretch. No, I'm just kidding. But by the second season, all bets were off, and it was a whole different thing.
Yeah. So now talk about like kind of like taking the reins and because that's what made me more excited for the show. Now because I said I wanted to see you and you kind of like took over because for whatever reason, like I don't know whatever reason, like they decided to like cut the characters down and stuff like that. And just
I think the characters
in Armitage, I believe.
Yeah. I remember after the first season there was because that was between the first and the second seasons when I did Fists of Iron. Yeah. And I remember there was a period where I was getting wind of the fact that they were going to come back and do Acapulco Heat again because it wasn't for sure at that point. But they were saying, they were even saying it on the set. I remember Spencer Rushford, who played one of my compadres in the first season. He was coming going, yeah, they're coming back. I'm in for sure. He's like, oh, he was telling me, he goes, but we're coming back. I was like, oh shit. I was like, oh, who's going? I was like, so I kept thinking, if they come back, it'd suck to not be in this, And then at some point, I think what had happened was, from my understanding anyway, they wanted to cut it down because it was just complex and expensive. They shot the first season on 35 millimeter. By the time they got the second season, we were shooting on Super 16 to cut costs. And they knew that they just needed to get rid of people. So they wanted to just file it down. And Allison and I had, and it was sort of an intentional thing on the first season, even though we were competing against Brendan and Catherine Oxenberg. I said, every time we get up there and we do something together, let's try and create some weird dynamic. It can be that we would talk about this. We'd say it can be like we've got an attraction to each other, but we're not going to give into it. So we do it by being weird to each other. I said, whatever it was, and I can't always remember specifically, but I said, if we do that, there may be at least something where they go, something's going on there. Something's going on there. And sure enough, by the time we came back, we were the only two they brought back. And then they hired Krista Sauls and then Liddy Denier, who had been doing Tarzan for them.
Right.
So, I felt really, lucky and blessed. I mean, I got to pat myself on the back for getting the role, but I was very happy they picked me because, they could have gone a number of ways.
Absolutely. So now let's talk about Fist of Iron. This is number 2 on my top 3, so we talked about to be the best. Now, of course, Fist of Iron, I love, because not only does it have Marshall Teague in it, but again, Sam Jones, you have Flash Gordon, who I think it's like one of my favorite movies of all time. So just talk about Fist of Iron and because it again, had that, PM feel to it, and again, right. Matthias Hughes, who I interviewed, actually, funny story. I interviewed him like when I first started out, like I actually he was like one of my first interviews. I just got lucky because like he was doing Black Rose, and the PR people reached out to me, and I was like, oh my God. So yeah. So just talk about working with Marshall Teague, and I'll tell you in a couple seconds, so talk about working with him.
So I got a call from Richard Munchkin. Richard Munchkin, who's the director, had worked for PM Entertainment. He did their first movie, as a matter of fact, or he acted in it, but then he directed Ring of Fire 1 and Ring of Fire 2 with Don Dragon and Vince and everybody, and Ron and all the rest of those guys. Yeah. So he was basically going off to do his own PM. And so it was 21st Century, which he did with the producer Aaron Schiffman. Yeah. He came to me with a script and he said, Mike, I always wanted to work with you. Would you be open for doing this? And I remember I just come off of Acapulco Heat, and I was like going, oh God, do I want to go do another kickboxing competition thing? And I literally took me 2 days. I kept making excuses. I haven't quite read it yet, but because I wasn't sure I was going to do it, because it was not like, oh, I'm so better than this. It wasn't that kind of thing. It's just like I was getting worried that I was just going to keep doing kickboxing movies, and I just, and listen, I'll take that over working in a car garage maybe, but which ultimately I did in Fist of Iron. But so I said, you know what? I kind of like this idea. It seems a little more lighthearted. There's something sweet. I like that he lives on the beach. He's got the friend. There was just something that was a little less, I don't know. Whatever it was, it pulled at my strings at that time. And then when I found that I knew that Sam Jones was going to be on, I felt like you did. I was like, oh, Flash Gordon, my God, I can't turn that down. And so yeah, I got on the set, and I can. There's some funny stories on that. First off, I want to say that Sam Jones and Eric Lee, I thought, were such a great pair.
They were great in that movie.
So much. Yeah, I had so much fun working with those two. Sam's was super gruff. I was like this, and Eric's so spazzy and jumps around all the time, and he's super energetic. I actually wrote a sequel to Fist of Iron at one point, and I wanted, because I wanted to see them together so badly. I didn't care about me. I was just like, I wanted to write something for them. I was called like the toughest movie ever shot in Malibu, because like the 90% of the movie was all shot in Malibu. Right. But that was a lot of fun, I mean, Richard was great to work with, and Jenny Lee Harrison from, Three's Company. Matthias, I remember when they told me Matthias, I'd seen him in Come in Peace and some of his other movies, and I was like, oh, this guy's going to be such a jerk. I totally bought into that, and when he showed up, that dude was so, as because you talked to him, so cool, right? And so sweet, we'd be doing our fight scene, and I'd get in the ring with him, and I'd go, okay, let's go, let's try this. He goes, okay, Mike. He goes, don't hit me here. And don't hit me here. I go, what? He goes, well, I had a shot here the other day, and then here I got a little bit of a bruise. I'm like, okay. Well, how about I'm gonna do that? He goes, oh wait, don't. This is my hair extension. Don't pull. I'm going, Matthias, can I touch you anywhere? So, but he was hilarious. We had the best time, him and I. And then Marshall Teague. Great story about Marshall Teague. I met him on that movie. I was very aware of him from Roadhouse because I love that movie. So stoked about that. And Marshall and I became great friends. I call him Papa, that's usually what I call him. So Papa goes, so when we shot that movie, was when we had here in California, the gigantic Northridge earthquake that just wiped out LA. So I don't remember what day it was. The next day we were going to get up to go shoot, and that night is when the earthquake hit it. That was like 1 o'clock in the morning or something. And this is prior to cell phones, so nobody really knew what was going on. Well, Marshall Teague, whose bed actually flipped upside down apparently that night with him and his wife, he got in his 4x4 truck and drove to the state, drove through all the rubble. He drove through all the mountains to get there. He's the only one that drove to say, he's like, I'm here for work. It was like, Marshall, there's no work today. It's had this giant earthquake. So, but then we picked it back up a few days later and kept going.
Yeah, I talked to him a couple months ago. I again, you know, and we talked about U.S. SEALs too, which I'll get in a couple minutes here. But yeah, like he had mentioned, like, you know, working with you and everything, and I was like, because I was such a fan, you know. And he's like, well, you should be, and I'm like, well, yes, I am, you know. So I was like, yep, you're talking to one of them.
And Marshall and we talk about the real deal. Marshall, you know, I used to go to his house for barbecues, and I mean, this guy had a basement in his house where he would make his own ammunition. Oh, I mean, he made his own. I saw a video of him hunting a wild boar with just a knife. They shot video of it. I mean, this guy is the real deal. A vet, you know, ex-police officer. I mean, as tough as they come, but like a total sweetheart. And I love the guy to death. But yeah, he's the real guy.